At the launch of Season 21, which was 2 months ago at this point, the underperforming and often overlooked Warlock Exotic chest piece, Chromatic Fire, saw a nice buff to its overall utility. Previously, the Exotic just granted your kinetic weapons a souped-up version of Dragonfly. Secure a precision kill, enemy goes boom, damages everything around it. I mean, cool concept, but it was never anything to get overly excited about. With Season of the Deep though, the explosions were given more damage, a larger blast radius, and a secondary effect that was linked to your equipped subclass. Arc carries a blinding effect, Solar scorches targets, Stasis slows, Strand severs, and Void weakens. Each can be nice in their own right, but they do also open the door for some additional subclass synergy. All in all, a solid buff for Chromatic Fire, on paper. The change left me with some questions though. Like, how much damage are we dealing? How big is the blast radius now? What are we getting out of these elemental effects in terms of application and duration? And maybe most importantly, is this an exotic that's actually worth using now? Well, that's what we're here to explore. First, the explosion itself. How much damage is it dealing? And I'll test this in the Spire of the Watcher dungeon versus Red Bar Goblins and Major Minotaurs, since adds are the most applicable target. Regardless of enemy tier though, I was seeing 11,868 as the maximum damage dealt. And this wasn't affected by the subclass, and didn't seem to be able to be brought up by any acquired damage buffs. Just shy of 12,000 appears to be the static maximum damage in this activity. For the blast radius, we'll hop over to PvP real quick so we can more accurately measure it out. If an enemy target eats the full force of the blast, it's going to deal 101 points of damage, and that can be achieved from up to about 2.5 meters away. Moving out past that, damage is going to gradually diminish until we hit about the 6 meter mark, which is the very edge of the effective radius. As long as the enemy takes some damage from the blast though, the elemental status effect will be applied. And regarding those status effects, let's see exactly what they're providing. Starting out with Solar. Enemies damaged from the blast will receive 15 Scorch stacks, which fall off in about 2 seconds. So, not much. And I do feel like Bungie probably could have been a little more generous with this, but it is what it is. Those Scorch ticks add on an additional 14 points of damage in PvP, and in my PvE test environment, they're netting us another 1,030 on top of the blast. Honestly, a bit underwhelming on its own, but it does open up the door for a few additional avenues for synergy. Ember of Searing grants melee energy and a fire sprite when defeating a scorched target. An Ember of Singeing boosts your class ability recharge rate just for scorching a target. So, a few decent options if you are running Chromatic Fire with Dawnblade. With the Voidwalker subclass selected, you're going to be applying the standard Void Weaken. This equates to a 15% target debuff in PvE and roughly 7.5% in PvP. For the weaken duration, you're looking at about 6 seconds in PvE environments and 3 seconds in the Crucible. And a free debuff for doing something that you're going to be doing anyway, that being shooting enemies in the face, or the stomach, is pretty decent in my book. As far as subclass synergy, there's really not much that pairs directly, but there is a good fragment tucked away in there. Echo of Harvest. Defeating a weakened target creates a Void Breach and an Orb of Power. If you have some way of using these Void Breaches, it's not a bad investment even with the -10 intellect penalty. Onto the Arc subclass, and the explosion is carrying a blinding effect, rendering PvE targets non-combative for a period of time. And I do like this play a lot. Being able to blind targets, especially in higher end PvE content, can be pretty darn useful. And the effect does last for approximately 8 seconds, which is a good window. In PvP, I think radius to the blast is affecting blind intensity. It's a tough call though, I did put both on screen so you could decide for yourself. But the effect is going to clear up rather quickly, only lasting for about a second or two. For synergy here, the Electrostatic Mine aspect will allow you to create an Ionic Trace when defeating a jolted or blinded target. Also, if you tend to run Spark of Brilliance, running Chromatic Fire on Arc can directly replace that fragment, leaving room for something else. Onto our Darkness subclasses, and starting out with Strand. The blast is going to sever targets. This reduces the damage output of PvE enemies by about 33%, and 15% in PvP. The total duration is going to be right around 7 seconds, regardless which side of the game you're looking at. And I think this could be a nice pairing if you're also making use of Woven Mail. Woven Mail is already offering some big damage reduction, and with the Sever, you're lowering the amount of incoming damage that you're going to be receiving. So both working in tandem can provide some nice survivability. Also, the Thread of Continuity fragment does seem to extend that sever duration up to around 11 seconds. And for a little icing on the cake, when a severed enemy is defeated, they do generate a tangle. Lastly, Stasis, where we're applying slow stacks to targets through the explosion. Any enemy caught by the blast will take on 30 stacks. So it would take an enemy eating 4 blasts in short order to directly secure a freeze, which is unlikely. All on its own though, slow is a good passive benefit. Cutting the pace of enemy movement for 6 seconds, and that is applicable for PvP and PvE, and making them an easier target is never a bad thing. In terms of synergy, we have Whisper of Refraction for class ability energy when defeating a frozen or slowed target, but sadly Whisper of Durance did not seem to extend the slow duration. It does specify that the slow needs to be delivered through abilities, so that's probably the catch there. These 30 slow stacks that we're applying though, if paired with a Duskfield grenade or a Bleak Watcher turret, could help secure a freeze a little bit quicker, depending on the situation. But here's the breakdown for each subclass when paired with Chromatic Fire if you want to screenshot it for your own records or whatnot. And it's worth noting that any of these status effects that do have anti-champion capabilities tied to them can be applied through the Chromatic Fire Blast. And since the effect is linked to the exotic armor piece and not the weapon, you don't have to worry about champion mod overlap canceling things out. Now, it is an indirect way of stunning a champion since it does require kill activation on a separate target, but I mean, the possibility is there. With that out of the way, should we talk guns? I feel like we should probably talk guns. What pairs nicely with Chromatic Fire? Now, any kinetic weapon, be it special or primary, that you can consistently land your crits with should work just fine. Personally, I lean toward high damage single shot precision based options, especially in more difficult content. And I do tend to go with primaries more often just because Chromatic Fire at its core is geared toward ad clearing. So scouts, bows, some pulses, and hand cannons, especially next season since they're supposed to be getting a pretty decent PvE damage buff. Those weapon classes kinda get my first looks because it does need to be the precision damage that secures the kill to proc the explosion. Now, I will say, I had extremely high hopes for Wishender. A fantastic bow for high-level content in its own right, anti-barrier utility built in, add explosive damage with an elemental status effect on top of that, endgame gold, right? And while it can work out pretty good sometimes, only about a third of Wishender's single-shot damage is precision-based. The other 2/3 approximately comes from the punch-through damage, which is not precision-based. If one of those damage ticks ultimately secures the kill, no kablooey. So while Wishender certainly can work in some situations, it just wasn't as consistent as I hoped. I did find Revision 0 to be a very suitable replacement though. It is a pulse rifle, but when used in the 2-burst fire mode, it really minimizes the risk of one of those rounds sneaking off for a body shot kill. It also has intrinsic anti-barrier, with the added benefit of being able to fire off high damage sniper rounds once the weapon is charged up. In the past, I honestly didn't really use Revision 0 all that much, just because I thought it felt a little bland. Pairing it with Chromatic Fire really broke it out of that workhorse exotic framework, at least in my opinion. I think the same could be said for Dead Man's Tale. Its damage profile for a scout rifle in PvE is pretty darn good, but it did leave you needing to pick through enemies one by one. But when you attack on high damage explosions and applied status effects, it kinda changes the whole dynamic of the weapon. Along the same lines, maybe think about trying out Hawkmoon. Its paracausal shot hits for some serious damage on both sides of the game. In PvE, the added ad clearing potential while working your way up to that point makes it feel a lot less like an exotic that can only really shine in PvP. It's also worth noting, if you do have a kinetic weapon with the Firefly perk, you're going to be credited for damage from both explosions. Extra collateral damage in PvE when ad clearing is never a bad thing, and it can have some nice implications in PvP, especially in your 6v6 game modes where Guardians do tend to group up a bit more. So with something like this Hung Jury and Chromatic Fire, combined we're looking at a total of 182 points of maximum collateral damage. I mean, sneeze on that enemy and they will die. Now if you're using Ace of Spades, its Firefly does seem to be toned down a touch, with the damage from both explosions netting 157 in total. But still, that could leave a secondary target one body shot away from going down. And even though I only highlighted a handful of weapons here, there are definitely other good options out there to pair with Chromatic Fire. I tried to select a few that would maybe get your brain gears turning. You know, maybe think outside the box with this one. You might be pleasantly surprised by the results. The ultimate question though, is Chromatic Fire an exotic worth equipping now? In my opinion, I think it can be, but you gotta want it to be. For most of our subclasses, I can think of at least a few exotics that I would probably equip before this one. But if you want to use it, or you're just torn on what exotic to equip, Chromatic Fire is by no means a detriment. There's no downfall with tacking on collateral damage to any of your kinetic weapons, and each individual status effect could be useful in some way, shape, or form. The strongest of which I do think is Arc Blind. It's just such a useful affliction in a wide variety of content. Not to mention the fact that the artifact here in Season 21 is favoring the usage of an arc subclass. But even when that changes next season, Chromatic Fire is subclass neutral. It can adapt. So I mean, if Solar's featured, if Stasis is featured, this is still going to be an option. Would I put Chromatic Fire right up at the top of my list? No. But with the recent retuning, it is a lot higher up there than it used to be. So while it still isn't, and probably never will be, a meta-defining exotic, I think it's finally become one that is at least worth some consideration. But that's all I got for you today. I appreciate you taking the time to check out the video. If you did enjoy it, please remember to leave it a like. You guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.